everybody, Becca Chase here. I am back with you, and I hope you know that by now, any chance I get to be with you, I am always going to take my opportunity to talk about the Old Testament. I love the Old Testament. I've been over this. I love the history. I love the stories. And I know not everyone feels the same way. I know that for some people, the Old Testament is kind of tough reading. Some of the stories and the narratives are a little bit tough to get through, and I completely understand that. I appreciate that. Let me give you a couple of my helpful tips in reading the Old Testament. Two things. Whenever I'm reading any story or text, I always ask myself two questions. The first one being, what is this telling me about God, about who God is? And the second one is, how is this pointing me to Jesus? So just keep those things in mind when you're reading the New Testament. And today, as we look at this amazing little story in Genesis chapter 15. And in Jewish tradition, this story is known as the Covenant of the Pieces. So this story takes place before Israel exists. This is before Moses and the Red Sea and the Ten Commandments and all of that. This story is about Abram, who became known as Abraham, who was the man chosen by God to be the father of God's people, was Father Abraham. God's chosen people would be descended from Abraham, and eventually Jesus would be descended from him as well. So God gives this promise to Abram just a few chapters before. In chapter 12, he says to Abram, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. You will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the people on earth will be blessed through you. And at the time God made this promise to Abram, Abram was 75 years old. Abram was also childless. No children. There was also this issue of not having any land for this great nation to inhabit, to live. So this is what he's faced with. He's got this promise from God on one hand, maybe some questions on the other, and this is chapter 15. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me, since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him, This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land and take possession of it. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a pigeon. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, Know for certain that 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, To your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. Over the past couple of years, I have been learning about Indigenous history in Canada and about colonization. And by no means at all am I an expert at this point in my life, but I probably, like many of you, have realized that I was not taught the full version of events and the full history of Indigenous Canadian relations. But I'm also realizing that having not been taught it at this point in my life is not a good enough excuse to still not know about it and acknowledge it. So I've been trying to do some learning on my own and listening, and I'm so glad that we're making attempts and steps towards reconciliation and education about specifically the mistreatment of our Indigenous people, but obviously we have a long way to go. But one thing that I have learned in my studies, and one of the ways in which colonization has been so effective in Canada, has been through treaty making. So a treaty is basically a formal agreement between two parties. And one of the big questions that we have to ask ourselves when we talk about the treaties and when we look back at the treaties that we've made with Indigenous people is, how can two parties make fair and equitable agreements and arrangements when these two parties don't share a common language, when they have completely different cultures and backgrounds, when they don't even share the same worldview, when they don't share the same framework of land ownership? Basically, the answer is that they cannot. There cannot be fair and equitable arrangements when one side especially seems to be holding all of the power in recording the treaty and detailing the treaty. So a lot of these treaties that were made and that were agreed upon, each party would have had very diverging interpretations of what was written or what was understood within those treaties. For the Indigenous people, emphasis would have been placed on the oral contents of those treaties. Culturally, for the Indigenous, oaths and histories were passed down orally. There was a big emphasis on ceremony, iconography. Meanwhile, for the Crown, they would have placed all their emphasis on what was actually written and recorded for those treaties on paper. So there was this disagreement between the spirit and the intent of the treaties, and ultimately, I think you could see, and I've been beginning to see, how there's no fair, there's no common ground in that treaty making. Everything is kind of sided to the one with all the power. And in ancient Mesopotamia, at the time of Abram, their treaties or oaths were also ceremonial and oral rather than written, signed contracts. And they looked like this in ancient times. You would get some animals, you would cut them in half, you would lay each half on the ground, and then each party would walk through those pieces. And in doing so, what you were saying was, may I become like these pieces if I fail to uphold my end of this deal. And this was known as karat berit. In Hebrew, it literally means to cut a covenant. So I want to look at the significance of the fact that God would do this with Abram, right? And what that tells us about who God is and what kind of God he is. And the first thing that is significant to me here, again, especially again in light of what I've been learning about treaty making in Canada and the injustice and the imbalance of power that can be there, is that here God has communicated with Abram in a way that he clearly would have understood. Right? There's no risk of not finding that common ground for these two parties, because God literally just goes to Abram's ground. He communicates in a way Abram would recognize and understand. He solidifies his promise to Abram through this human method of cutting a covenant with him. And we know Abram recognized that this is what God was doing, because Abram knew exactly what came next when God asked him to go get those animals. He knew to go ahead and cut the pieces. He knew to place them side by side, each half. He knew that this was karat berit, that God was making a covenant with him. And this is so amazing to me, especially considering, again, the imbalance, the incredible imbalance of power here. This was God of the universe, making an oath to this human Abram in a language Abram would understand, through a ceremony that Abram would understand, through a method that Abram would understand. What kind of God cuts covenants with humans? Doesn't seem to make any sense. Now, again, this covenant ceremony, it all came about in the first place because Abram had some questions and some doubts. Right? In verse 2, he asks God, "What can you give me?" And in verse 8, he says, "How can I know this?" So the fact that God acknowledges these questions of Abram, and he not only answers him, but he makes a covenant with him. This shows me that God is not swayed by doubt. Right? He isn't put off by it. He doesn't reject us for it. And he didn't do that here with Abram. Paul Tillich writes that doubt isn't the opposite of faith. It is an element of faith. And you've probably heard faith described as believing without seeing. Right? That's a pretty common definition of what faith is. But there's also this distinction that this Jewish rabbi writes specifically in reference to Abram's faith. He says that faith does not mean believing in spite of the evidence. It means trusting profoundly in a person. Trusting profoundly in a person. I love this definition of believing, this definition of faith. God recognizes that Abram trusts in him, but also that Abram has questions. And these questions, they don't cancel out the trust. They coexist. And in verse 6, it says, Abram believed the Lord. And then right after, in verse 8, Abram says, "But how can I know?" Right? So he says, "I believe. Here in my heart, I believe. But how can I know?" Up here. And, oh, Abram, I feel you on that. This is so often my problem too. I get this on a deep level. How can I know in my mind what I believe to be true in my heart? I'm always battling with that disconnect. But Abram, Rebecca, it is okay to ask questions. God will not reject you for it. But what kind of God allows you to question him. I would say that a God who is absolutely committed to his promises, a God who is absolutely committed to blessing his people and all people. I think that is the kind of God that cuts a covenant with humans. That is the kind of God that lets humans question him and express their doubts in his presence. You know, I mentioned that this covenant ceremony was a common known custom that two parties took part in, right? But if you noticed in the story, Abram doesn't walk through the pieces. God alone walks through those pieces in the form of a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch. And we don't exactly know why God chose to represent himself in these images. It may be that that's what Abram had with him. But if we look ahead to Exodus, we have a little clue there about when God was leading his people out of Egypt. His presence was with them in the form of this pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. And this seems to be similar to that. The smoking fire pot and this flaming torch passed through the pieces. God fulfills the role of both parties in this covenant act. And Abram did nothing. Right? He has no obligations to the covenant. He did nothing to earn the promise in the first place other than just believe in God. Right? Abram had faith in God. He trusted profoundly in God. But that was it. He had no part in this act of cutting the covenant. And this means that not Abram or anyone else can do anything that would break the covenant or null the promise. Right? Because God can't go back on his own word. It's not in his nature. So this is an invoidable promise that God has made. And he alone has passed through the pieces. He alone has made the covenant and cut the covenant. Because it's God alone who is committed to the promise. God keeps his promises. He sees his promises through. And you know this particular promise. Do you know where he sees it through to? It's Jesus. Jesus is the promise. He is the culmination of this covenant that was cut. He is the culmination of everything in the Old Testament. That's why we always look for him. Look for him in there because it's all pointing to him, the culmination of the covenant. And I think Jesus pretty clearly demonstrates all the same things about God that we see revealed in this story as well. Like all these things about his character. We think about that for a minute. This God who makes covenants with humans, who meets them on their level, who communicates with them in ways that they could understand. That, to me, sounds like Emmanuel, God with us. Right? That sounds like God in the flesh, in Jesus, coming to dwell among us. That sounds like Jesus speaking to crowds of people on the hillside, in parables, in stories that they could understand, that they could share, that they could keep and carry with them. I think accepting our questions and our doubts and not rejecting us for it, that sounds like Jesus, right? Doesn't that sound like Jesus who told Thomas, come, feel, put your fingers here, feel where they put the nails in my hand. He didn't push him away. He didn't tell him to leave. He welcomed him with his doubts. I just love that we can follow those threads from the old to the new, And we can see the same God working and moving and being faithful and loving his people all the way through. He's the same God. He's the same God revealed in the pages of the Old Testament to the New Testament. He is never changing. He is always faithful. He's the same. And my hope for you today is that for whatever you're going through, whatever promises you might be waiting on, whatever doubts you might be having, that you can know today that this same God who passed through the pieces to show how committed he was to keeping his promise. This is the same God that hears your prayers and your questions, and he's inviting you to believe. He's inviting you to trust him profoundly and let you see the blessings that he's promised in Jesus. That's it. Let me just simply pray this benediction over you today. May the Lord bless you and protect you. May the Lord smile on you and be gracious to you. May the Lord show you his favor and give you his peace. Amen. Thanks, friends. I will see you next time.